BoJack Horseman.
This show has been around for quite a while, but I only recently got around to watching it. I watched all 6 seasons of this show in about a month, so there's a little insight into my life, and I found this show to be pretty enjoyable. I'm not in love with it, but it's also far from horrible. I would definitely say it's more on the good side than the bad side overall. I liked more about it than I disliked. So, BoJack Horseman is a Netflix original animated series about BoJack Horseman. I know. Riveting. Now, my boy BoJack is a horse, as you might imagine, so that's pretty cool. If you like horses, he is one, so that's sick. The show is essentially about how he's struggling with his past and who he is as a person because he doesn't think he's a great guy. And he's correct. So the show is sort of about him trying to fix himself. And it usually doesn't work. So this show does a very good job of telling the story that it wants to tell. I went into this show thinking that it would be something like Family Guy, like every episode is independent, and it's really just there to make you laugh and not much else. And there are some pretty good jokes in this show, but it also tells a story, and that story can be kind of a gut punch sometimes. There are quite a few hard-hitting moments in this show. I guess a good way to put it is that the viewing of this show was not as casual as I thought it was going to be. I found myself invested in the characters, and I was curious to see how the story wrapped up. The story in this show is actually really good. There's a lot of different characters, and there's a lot of different subplots. There are like 3 or 4 different branches of the story, I guess. Sometimes it can get kind of confusing because sometimes you'll just forget what a certain character was up to, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to keep track of. Also, the world in this show feels very, I don't know, is full the right word? It feels very fleshed out because it feels like everything in this show happens for a reason. There's really nothing that happens just because, at least not anything that I can really think of right now. Sometimes the show calls back to things that happened seasons ago, stuff that you've completely forgotten about, and that kind of stuff is always pretty impressive to me. I just think it's cool. Something that happened a long time ago is just now having consequences. I'm a big old fan. So the story in the show, it's pretty amazing. I would say it's one of the best stories I've ever experienced, at least in an animated show. The characters in this show all feel very real, even though half of them are animals, so I mean, that's something to take into account. But the characters deal with very real situations for the most part. I mean, there are some funny shenanigans. We really feel like we know the characters pretty well, and they react to things and do things that people would do. Again, for the most part, because, I mean, we got some shenanigans. As I said, I went into this show just expecting it to be funny and nothing else, really, but, it was something else. The show is nowhere near as funny as I thought it was going to be. There are definitely some funny bits, but the show is more story-driven than comedy-driven, by far. But something throughout the show that I found maybe not super funny, but at least amusing, is that there are animal people in this universe. And I mean, there are plenty of scenes, usually establishing shots of buildings or something like that, where there is some kind of big visual funny with some animal. It's kind of hard to explain, even though it's probably not, and I'm just not very articulate, but it's fun. A good example is when someone says man, there's a mosquito in my tent, and then the camera zooms out and there's a mosquito there, but it's actually a mosquito person. I don't know, I enjoyed that. I thought it was kind of funny. Or there are birds, right? But they're people, so when they fly, they just kind of flap their arms and it looks really funny. So there is a pretty good amount of visual comedy in this show, just because animals. There are also some jokes that run throughout the entire show, but they're very small and you forget about them most of the time. One of those types of things that I can think of right now is that there's a joke that spans throughout literally the whole show about how honeydew sucks, and it does, but it's only mentioned once every season, so every time it happens you're like, oh yeah, that's funny. But you forget about it the rest of the time, so I mean, I don't know, I appreciate that. So this show is moderately funny sometimes. Do not go into this show just to get a laugh because you'll be disappointed. One thing that is quite apparent in this show is that the people that were in charge of making it were allowed to do whatever they want. There's an intro sequence in each episode. I skip it most of the time because Netflix, but sometimes I don't just because, I'm feeling spicy that day. And the intro sometimes changes depending on the episode, sometimes in pretty major ways. There are also entire episodes where they try out different concepts. There's an entire episode where BoJack is speaking at a funeral for 27 minutes, and that's the entire episode. I will admit that is sort of on and off for me, just because, I mean, some of the concepts I'll enjoy and some of them I won't. That's just kind of a risk you gotta take. A good portion of this show relates to a sitcom within this universe that BoJack was a part of. So, for a big funny, the makers of this show created an intro for that sitcom and put it up as a separate thing on Netflix. The sitcom was filmed in like the 80s or 90s, and it says that on Netflix, like the date says 1980 whatever, so that's comedy. But it's very clear that this show is not on network TV. It seems like the people in charge of this show were given complete creative control and a deadline for the entire season, and that's it. And that, when combined with people who actually care about what they're making, usually leads to a pretty good show. That being said, this show is not without its issues, one of which is one that I already went over. I expected sort of a good mix of story and big funnies, but there's a lot more story than jokes, and that's not a problem in itself, but I feel like the show is kind of inconsistent with that, because there are some episodes where there are a whole bunch of jokes, but then other episodes are purely dramatic, like not funny at all. And I'm just like, boys, can we figure it out, please? I was furious. Sometimes it just kind of felt like the show didn't know if it wanted to be more serious or more funny, and I just felt like it kind of showed. But this issue really isn't a huge one. It didn't bother me too much, but it was like just enough to notice. Another issue that I have with this show is that sometimes we go entire episodes without even seeing BoJack at all, and I understand why they do that. Stuff happens in the show that causes that, but I just feel like the show is called BoJack Horseman. He's the main character, and he's my favorite character, so I would rather see him in an episode of the show that is called his name. I can really only care about the side characters for so long. And the last thing, which I just thought was kind of an annoying recurring bit, was one character uses what is that word? Alliteration, and she does it too much. And it's just annoying to me, because then the overall point of her statement is lost, because then you're just like, she made the same sound a lot of times. I don't know, man. Maybe some people didn't mind it, but that got on my nerves. So those are my issues with this show. However, the good stuff far outweighs the bad stuff, in my opinion. So in general, I enjoyed this show. Sometimes I enjoyed it more than other times, but overall, I would say it was an enjoyable viewing experience. So if you're just looking to laugh and just enjoy life like a dork, then I can't really recommend this show. But if you're looking for an animated show that has a story and is also not garbage, maybe check it out. But if you have seen this show, tell me what you think of it down in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike, or get this, shake up my soda bottle right before I open it. That would be funny. My name's Quibs, and